the church, if you were there at the service, I was setting you up. I apologize already. Remember, forgiveness. What's the most quoted book that Jesus used in the Old Testament? No. Totally set you up. Psalms. Psalms is the most quoted. 11 times. Deuteronomy comes in second at 10 times. Interesting. Isaiah comes in third of 8 times, and then Exodus 7 times. So I apologize for saying that. But the idea here is an important one still, that Isaiah plays this huge role in interpreting the story that Jesus says I'm a part of. So that's why, I listed these out. I'm sure you can't see them in the back, but you get the idea here. In December, every Sunday we're reading from Isaiah. And in January, every Sunday, we're reading from Isaiah. And Christmas Eve, these are other, you can have various Christmas celebrations. So Christmas Eve, Christmas 2, Christmas 3, the Sunday after Christmas, first Christmas, Epiphany, all Isaiah texts. So for 2 straight months, there's no other example in the Old Testament where we read, where it shapes our worship as much as Psalms, and here Isaiah. But now here is the problem with Isaiah. It's a complex book. It's really complex, and so if you've ever tried to sit down and read it, you can get stumped by the names, by the history that's involved. It's quite detailed. And so I was going over this with Nina, and she said, don't bore them. And so I started going into the Assyrian kings, reviewing Sargon II, and Tilgath-Pilsner III, and Sennacherib, and she's already, she says, don't do that to them. So we're going to try to talk about Isaiah, because he's so important to us, but we're going to try to do this in a way to both respect the detail and to also respect the high-level role it plays in preaching God's judgment and God's message of hope. Okay, so here's, and Nina's back there. She'll tell me whether this is too boring or not.
I'll start snoring.
I hear you back there. All right. So a couple things I want to say about Isaiah. We're going to do this for 2 weeks. This is too much for today. So we're going to do some things today. We're going to do some things next week. And the reason, we try, rarely do we do something for 2 weeks. It's because it's so important and so complex. So the first thing about Isaiah, it's an epic story. Epic, like what you read in college when you would read Ulysses, right? I mean, the thick book. And so what's your favorite story out of Ulysses that you remember? Anything? What's the storyline? Oh boy. What? Okay, it's an adventure, right? It's the classic where you leave home, Troy, you fight a battle, right? And then after the battle, he goes, on all these adventures. And everybody's got their favorite one, like the sirens, right? And sometimes you don't read the whole story, you just read the sirens, because that's the story you really love. And then he goes back home again, changed. By the way, it's an interesting thing about epic storytelling. The one we're most familiar with, where you start at home, go through adventure, and you come back changed, is The Wizard of Oz. It's an epic storytelling where she starts in Kansas, right? She has this amazing experience. She goes back home changed. Now this is an epic that's not circular like that. It's not like Ulysses, and it's not like The Wizard of Oz. It spans 200 to 250 years of Israel's history. Okay, that's a long time. So in that there's going to be battles, and you're going to have names like Nebuchadnezzar and Sennacherib and Sargon II, and I won't go too much into the weeds yet. I'm going to go there though. And so when you've got 200 to 250 years, that's a lot compressed into 66 chapters. So I was wondering how it starts probably with Isaiah 6. If you got a Bible there, you want to turn it open to Isaiah. For example, if you look at Isaiah 1, this prophet Isaiah says, the vision of Isaiah son of Amoz, which he saw concerning Judah and Jerusalem in the days of, and here he names them, 4 kings. So the first Isaiah, it gets more complex than that. We have more than one Isaiah. But the first Isaiah, the prophet, writes during 4 kings, which is Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah. Okay, Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah. And one of the nice things about that list is it goes from bad to good to bad to good. Okay? Uzziah was bad. His son Jotham was good. His son Ahaz is bad.
Thank you.
And Hezekiah is good. So if you read Isaiah 1, just think it goes from bad to good to bad to good. And when it goes bad, it goes really bad. We're talking about bringing pagan worship into the temple of Israel, setting up pagan temples on every hill. Some of you have visited Jerusalem, and you know the high hills that surround Jerusalem. There were pagan altars on all those hills, but also placed in the temple itself, borrowed from Assyria. So Isaiah sees all this, and he is going to write and interpret what's happening in this grand epic story. So there'll be a couple themes that run through all of Isaiah, but just think complex story. Now I was thinking about, okay, you know, I've got Nina in my ear saying, don't be boring, don't be boring. What other epic stories do we have? And I thought, oh, we have one coming out next week. Star Wars, which is an epic story, right? I mean, do we have any, who has seen a Star Wars film? Come on, you can raise your hand. How many have seen more than one? All right. Now you tell me, Rise of Skywalker comes out December 20th. I get a kickback from doing this advertising. Where does this episode coming out on December 20th fit into the whole epic story of Star Wars? Can anyone explain that?
It's a prequel to the trilogy.
What's that?
It's a prequel to the trilogy.
It's a prequel to the trilogy. So that's, okay, that's, you can sense then an epic story, you gotta know where it belongs. Now some of us like to just go and see the one film and then you go, well, that's fine, but I don't care about the rest of the story. Others of you, however, are bothered if you don't know the whole storyline. And so you will go and watch Star Wars movies the week before so that you can put it within the grand narrative, right? And everybody's different. Why do I mention that? Because that's what's going to happen at Christmas. We're going to take one verse out of Isaiah, either Isaiah 7 or Isaiah 9, right? We're going to read that, and most of us will be happy with just that one text about a woman, young woman giving birth to Emmanuel, God with us. But it, like Star Wars, it's part of a grander narrative. And so today we want to talk about the grander narrative beginning, but also not forget its importance to enjoy each and every story as well. And so here is my attempt. Watch how they try to tell the grand narrative of Star Wars.
It's an instinct. A feeling. The force brought us together. We're not alone. Good people will fight if we lead them. People keep telling me they know me. No one does. Come through. taking one last look, son, at my friends. What you fear is the destiny that lies. Your destiny. The force will be with you. Always.
Where are the captions? Okay, now, it's interesting that at Christmas time, Hollywood likes to show us epic stories. I mean, the big stories of good versus evil, you know, in the world. It's kind of interesting. Now, one of the great things about film is, for example, the woman, right? Who's the young woman who's fighting. You know she's good because she's wearing white. And you know the other guy is evil because he's wearing black. Okay, we don't have that in Isaiah. Well, we do, but it's more subtle. That's the problem. We don't have the visuals to help us who are the good guys sometimes and who are the bad guys. Okay, but it's the same type of storytelling. And again, just like Star Wars, there's a lot of battles. If you want to, you know, spend a whole weekend reviewing, what's it, 12 episodes or, you know, the trilogy, 3 in each one, right? So here's Isaiah. We're going to run from 738, which is when the year that Uzziah dies. And right afterwards is the Syro-Ephraimite War. Probably something you've not heard of in the past. Not too many, we just don't talk about that war very much. It was 3 years, but it shapes the beginning narrative. 721, Israel falls. Now, when I talk about Israel, it's the 10 tribes in the north. They cut off from the south. And sometimes we call it Israel, and sometimes in the Bible they call it, especially in Isaiah, Ephraim, which is the largest tribe in the north. So instead of, that's the shorthand, Ephraim. And in the south, there are 2 tribes. The largest is Judah. So sometimes in Isaiah, that's the language they talk about. They talk about Judah and Ephraim. Israel falls in 721. The Assyrians, these are just some key dates that play a role in Isaiah. 587 is the fall of Jerusalem by Babylon. And then in 500, they're already back trying to rebuild Jerusalem. All this year, 738 to 500, Isaiah is speaking to all those epochs. It's, so, 250 years. It's like telling the whole history of the United States in one book with 66 chapters. So that's the beauty of it. Because Isaiah is interpreting their whole history at these critical moments in a spiritual fashion, but also in a political fashion. But it's a lot of history. The second thing to realize, there are multiple authors. It's one book, multiple authors. 3 basic chapters. The first are chapters 1 through 39. And those chapters deal with pre-Babylon. All these battles that we'll be talking about in 738, they're being challenged by the Assyrians. And Isaiah is politically astute. He knows his stuff. He knows world politics well. And he's interpreting that spiritually in chapters 1 through 39. Although he borrows some stuff. You might call it plagiarism. He borrowed 3 whole chapters from Kings and just stuck it in his book because he liked it. And that's kind of, we call it plagiarism now, but that was really how people used to write, is if they liked something, they would just pass it on. And Isaiah does that with 1 Kings. Then things change in Isaiah, beginning in 40 to 55. Here, the prophet is not calling to judgment and hope and saying, if you don't shape up, Assyria is going to punish you. Assyria is going to destroy you. That's 1 through 39. But in 40, they're already in exile. So now we know, because they're talking about exile and life in Babylon, it's another prophet. But he's interpreting now the exile with the same themes that first Isaiah did. He's saying, I agree with first Isaiah. I agree with what he wrote, and that helps us interpret our life in exile. And then the third Isaiah, oh my goodness, this is when they're come back out of Babylon. They're trying to rebuild Jerusalem, and to be quite honest, they're disappointed. They thought this was going to be grand and glorious, because that's what Isaiah promised in 1 through 39. They come back, and to call life in Jerusalem at that time modest is an exaggeration. Their children are diseased, crops aren't growing, they're depressed. Is this what God promised us? And so it's probably a collection of prophets at that time who go back to Jerusalem and say, God is faithful, God will provide a new Jerusalem. Okay, so we've got all three. Nobody tells you that when you read the book. So you just got to know this. Otherwise, when you move from 39 to 40, it's abrupt. You can tell something just happened in the book. All right, lots of politics. Oh boy. Now, this is, Nina, don't get bored. Take out your first sheet, and you're going to see all the major powers are battling it out, and Isaiah is going to interpret that. So it's like Isaiah today would read the New York Times, I'd say, and interpret to us what's going on in Syria, what's going on in Egypt, what's going on in the Middle East, right? By the way, what's going on in Syria now? Who's in charge? Things have changed over the last 6 months. Right? Used to be, we had a stronger presence there. Now we have a weaker presence. Who's entered into Syria? Russia. Now, this is all what's happening here. Right? Same players to some degree, right? Some of the same players. But every time there's a death of a king, somebody else says, okay, now we can become independent. I'm tired of paying tribute to some of these kings. And so the whole time when we read Isaiah, we have to know the world politics going on. Do you see, let's just review a couple. Egypt. Do you find Egypt? Because the map has a sort of a different angle. Everybody wanted to conquer Egypt. Why? And what about the river? In January it floods. It's got some of the best agricultural land. They could feed armies and peoples with their wheat. So Rome wanted to conquer them, Greece wants to conquer them, Assyria wants to conquer them, Babylon wants, everybody wants Egypt because of its wealth. Now can you see where Jerusalem is? Now what they don't name there is Israel to the north of that. So you've got, and that by this time of Isaiah, it's a separate country. And it doesn't get along with Judah. It doesn't get along with the people who lived in Jerusalem. So they're now in conflict. Then you've got Syria, right? Just north of there, and Phoenicia, which is on the coast. All these are different powers that are playing geopolitical games with each other. Then you can see the biggest power at this time is Assyria. Do you see where they are? That's the upper Mesopotamia. You can guess why they're rich. They're between two rivers in kind of a hostile environment. And so they've always been known for their wealth. In fact, we still talk about their capital being one of the most beautiful capitals of all the world of all time. And that capital was? Nineveh. Nineveh. Right? And so some will talk about the gardens of Nineveh, but others will talk about the gardens of Babylon. You know, these one of the 8 wonders of the world. And because of the wealth that were in these two capitals. But at this time, even though they're together in Iraq today, at that time they were two different powers. One was Nineveh and the Assyrians. One was Babylon, the Babylonians. And they hated each other. In the stuff that we have in the British Museum, the Assyrians always would write that they had a Babylon problem. Who's going to solve the Babylon problem? Because the Babylonians didn't want to pay tribute to the Assyrians. They wanted their independence. Well, who else wanted their independence? Judah, Jerusalem. The last power then is Persia. And if you want to take a look at their kingdoms, the next page gives you just some sense of how large and how small they were at certain times. So the Assyrian, you see how big that is, running from Babylon all the way to Egypt, right? Of course, they just wanted those agricultural lands. You see what happens with Babylon, although their reign didn't last quite as long as the Assyrians. And then the Persians come in with King Cyrus. King Cyrus in Isaiah is called the Messiah. So when we read that, we think initially of Jesus, but in Isaiah, when they talk about the Savior, because he's going to free them from Babylon, they call Cyrus the Messiah. All right. So here's where we're going to get in the weeds. So you got Syria, Egyptians, Assyrians, Babylonians, Persians. You got to love the Assyrians here. You got Tilgath-Pilsner III. You got Sargon II. You got Sennacherib. Anybody can come and spell Sennacherib next week. We'll have an extra credit. So let me tell you the story of Ahaz. He's the third king because he's the third king. He's an evil king. The reason I tell this story is because it dominates the Christmas story. We talk about the young woman Mary giving birth to a baby who we call Emmanuel. So while I tell the story, I want those on this side, if you have a Bible, if you will turn to Isaiah 7, 10 to 17. Because that will be the original story of the young woman promised to give birth to a child. On this side, if you will look at Matthew 1:22, because that's what we're going to read on Christmas Eve, these two texts. And I'm going to try to frame them within this story. So we got Matthew 1, verse 22. On this side, Isaiah 7, 10 to 17. And remember, this is part of this epic story, so we're just taking a little bit about it, but one that's really important for the Christmas story. So Ahaz, he's the king. He ruled for, I think, 4 years with his father. He came to the throne when he was 20. That's a lot of pressure for a 20-year-old. Because the first thing he hears is that the Assyrians want to come and destroy him. And so Israel comes down to Jerusalem along with Syria, and they said, we have a pact together. Israel, the top 10 tribes, and Syria. We've got to fight the Assyrians. Those are different now, Syria and the Assyrians. The Assyrians are up there, they're building their strength, they're going to come down and destroy them, and we've got to band together. And Jerusalem said, no, we're isolationists. We don't want that battle. And they said, well, you don't have an option. You will join us in battle against the Assyrians because we can't fight them alone. And Ahaz said, no, we're not going to do that. And in that environment, then Syria and Israel says, well, then we will force you. We'll go to battle with you. So here you got Israel and Syria going to battle Ahaz. He's worried about that because now he's got the Assyrians, and now he's got this other war on his hands. And of course, a lot of other of the neighbors are not friendly. You remember from Sunday school, the Philistines? They go, oh, let's take advantage of this. And they start looting some of the cities. And then you got the Edomites on the other side of the Jordan. They start attacking, and Ahaz is freaking out. Everybody is going to war with him. He said, I just want to be here in peace in Jerusalem. And so at this moment, in chapter 7, Isaiah comes to him with a prophecy. And says, don't worry about Israel and Syria. This is, by the way, the Ephraimite war. Don't worry, says Isaiah, about Israel and Syria. They will never enter into the gates of Jerusalem. However, because you're an evil king, the Assyrians will come later and destroy you. So again, Israel and Syria will not enter the gates of Jerusalem. They will be destroyed by the Assyrians. I mean, Israel, Isaiah's got these great insights. But later on, Assyria will come and destroy everything here. The Assyrians are powerful. He's trying to win them over, but he's also won over himself. In fact, he even sacrifices one of his sons to the god, to Moloch, which is like Baal. in some parts of the Old Testament, which meant he sacrificed his son to appease the Assyrian gods. The way it says it in Isaiah, his son walked through the fires of Moloch. And then they sacrificed him. So, here's this amazing story rooted in the Syro-Phoenician War with Isaiah giving a prophecy of judgment and hope. And now, 700 years later, we've got Matthew chapter 1, where we have another prophet in the spirit of Isaiah speaking to Joseph. Can someone on this side read that text? Matthew 1, verse 22. This is the one we all know for Christmas. Can you stand up and read it so everybody can hear you?
All this took place to fulfill what had been spoken by the Lord through the prophet. Look, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and they shall call him Emmanuel, which means God is with us. When Joseph awoke from sleep, he did as the angel of the Lord commanded him. He took her as his wife, but had no marital relations with her until she had borne a son, and he named him Jesus.
So where does Joseph get this message from the Lord? What's he doing? Sleeping. I do some of my best spiritual work when, some of us, you always wonder sometimes when you get up. And here he has this dream, and it's the whole dream, that's the point of this morning, is influenced by the story of Isaiah. Way back to these wars, this epic story, and all of a sudden God uses, in a dream, this epic story of Isaiah and says, don't put away Mary. She's part of the plan that goes all the way back to the prophecy that Isaiah gave. Pretty incredible. So, we want to continue. There's just so much here. We got to get to Sennacherib. You just got to get to Sennacherib. Okay, I'll give a test next time so you can spell Sennacherib. These kings will all play a role. This is brutality. This is brutal stuff. These are brutal battles. And we want to put that in the context of what we'll be reading in December and January. Yes?
It's rather hard for me to understand that Isaiah back then, Isaiah I thought was talking about the destruction of Jerusalem and the kings coming in then. And we translate that to saying Isaiah has predicted the coming of Christ. But he might have been talking about the coming of the king that built the temple.
So this is an excellent question. This sets us up for next week. I wish I could get it, because the prophecies of Isaiah are understood on multiple levels, because that's the way epic stories are told. But you're right. He's first talking about the destruction of the northern kingdom of Israel, and only later the destruction of Jerusalem that he predicts through the Babylonians. And he talks about the Assyrians and the Babylonians. He says, the Assyrians are going to punish us, but wait till the Babylonians come. But then he talks about certain phrases like Messiah. Initially, Messiah is not Jesus, it's Cyrus of Persia. But these are the texts then that the Christians and actually the Jews use to constantly interpret, constantly using these same phrases like the servant in Isaiah. And we'll go over that next time, how they have some specific references, but also some global references to the whole story. So that's a really important comment, and we want to hold on to that for next time. Let's close with a word of prayer. Good and gracious God, in this season we immerse ourselves in the epic story of Isaiah. And Lord, we pray that you would bless us as we hear these words once again, words from your scriptures that have been read for 2,700 years, that we would find ourselves in the story and you would bless us once again with the story of a young woman giving birth to Emmanuel. We pray all this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.